And I am going to assert, despite the fact we are pressed for time, I'm going to assert the privilege of my longevity and say a little bit more about how wonderful Fatima is before she gets to talk herself. So I'm entirely honored and delighted to introduce my friend Fatima El-Tayeb to you. If I were really to detail all of her scholarly, creative, and activist accomplishments, it would take longer than the talk she's going to deliver for us. But I can begin to outline them for you by telling you about the many contexts in which I've been fortunate enough to work with her. Though her reputation had preceded her, I believe I first met Fatima at the German Studies Association in 2000, where she presented a paper on a panel on whiteness and German national identity, which I believe was the first ever academic discussion of whiteness within North American German studies. That presentation took place just before the publication of and drew on the insights of Fatima's entirely path-breaking first book, Schwarze Deutsche, Rasse und nationale Identität, 1890 bis 1933, based on her dissertation at the University of Hamburg. But the next time I met Fatima, it was for a rather different, though I guess nonetheless somewhat related reason. In October 2001, she was a guest of honor at the Women in German Conference, which featured the entirely hilarious screwball comedy about Black German lesbians, for which she wrote the script, Alles wird gut. That film wasn't released commercially in North America for copyright reasons, but it can be shown in academic contexts. So I encourage you all to view it and show it to your friends and students, and I can only say that what the world gained when Fatima chose an academic career, it lost in a filmmaker. I almost had an opportunity to work with Fatima as a UMass colleague because in 2001, 2002, she was one of the three top candidates in our history department search. But then, as so often at UMass, there was a budget crisis and the position was lost. But as a kind of consolation prize, I was able to spend time with Fatima in Amherst when she spent spring 2002 as a Copeland Fellow, a kind of artist in residence, at Amherst College, nominated by Christian Rogowski, who was one of the co-organizers of the BGHRA conference at Amherst College in 2013. But then the most wonderful thing happened, very much as a result of Fatima's and our friend Peggy Pisha's wisdom, energy, and initiative. It happened that at the October 2002 conference of the German Studies Association in San Diego, the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation was recruiting for its trans-co-op grants, collaborations between U.S. and German academics. Fatima, Peggy, and I went to the Humboldt reception, held in balmy weather next to a swimming pool, drank lots of the free red wine, and by the end of the evening had decided to submit a trans-co-op proposal for a project on Black German studies. Fatima later quipped, and I have often quoted this, that it gave the term Schnapsidee a whole new meaning. Fatima and Peggy discovered that the Volkswagen Foundation also was soliciting grant proposals addressing multiculturalism, so the two of them wrote proposals for both grants, and to our astonishment, we got both of them. As you may know, we organized two conferences on Black European Studies in 2005 and 2006, and a conference on Black German Studies at UMass in April 2006, and I think these were the initiatives that jump-started both Black German Studies in North America and Black European Studies on the continent. It could not have been more of a joy to work on these projects with Fatima, Peggy, and Randolph Oxman, at that point the only Black German faculty member in Germany, whom we recruited to work with us. In the meantime, Fatima was ascending to ever greater heights of accomplishment. She left Amherst College to spend a year as scholar in residence at the University of Tennessee, and then was hired into a tenure-track position in the Department of Literature at the University of California at San Diego, where she's been ever since. There she is a professor of African American literature and culture, affiliated faculty with the Department of Ethnic Studies, and until recently, director of critical gender studies. I don't know if Fatima knows this, but I wrote letters of support both for her tenure decision and for her promotion to full professor. And one of the great things about writing such letters is that you have to, or maybe get to is a better way to put it, not only read, but actually study all the candidates' publications so that you can assess them for university committees. So I was fortunate enough to be able to read everything that Fatima had written, sometimes even before it appeared in print. Every one of Fatima's publications has been path-breaking, but I'll only tell you about her books here. Her second book, Queering Ethnicity, Minority Activism in Post-National Europe, 2011, illuminates resistance in the New Europe, focusing on forms of political organizing and cultural production by minorities and the second and third generation of economic and political migrants, showing how these populations claim political agency via cultural performance despite the exclusionary practices directed against them. Of particular importance is this book's refusal to think in national categories. I think we're going to see some more of that. Both pointing out similarities in various European countries' conceptions of self-identity vis-a-vis their own migrants and minorities, and also showing how those groups think translocally by drawing upon similar forms of opposition, most manifest in European minorities' appropriation of hip-hop. That book was also published in German in 2015 as Anders Europäisch, Rassismus, Identität und Widerstand im Vereinten Europa. Her most recent book, Undeutsch, Dekonstruktion des Anderen in der postmigrantischen Gesellschaft, 2016, likewise assumes the marginalized perspective of racialized populations who are constructed as Undeutsch, that is, are conceived not only not to belong to the national community, but even to endanger and destabilize it through their very presence. Meanwhile, Fatima concludes, the majority of German citizens comfortably maintain their ignorance, denying or downplaying structural racism, while simultaneously social violence continues to mount. This book brings a discussion of German and European racism up to the present, particularly by focusing on the instrumentalization of the attack on the Charlie Hebdo offices in January 2015 to demonize all people of Islamic background, and all of this, of course, could not be more timely. I concluded one of my recommendations for Fatima by saying this. This is a quote. I find Professor El-Tayeb to be a scholar of astonishing originality whose work is in the process of transforming a number of disciplines, and I expect similar original and innovative research productivity from her in the future. In some ways, one might even consider Professor El-Tayeb something like Gramsci's organic intellectual. Emerging from the circumstances about which she writes, she advances theoretical models that speak to that situation and assist the population she addresses in elaborating strategies of resistance. Now at this conference about, by, and for Black Germans, we are going to benefit once more from Fatima's insights as she helps us think about other emerging strategies of resistance. So I'm very much looking forward to her keynote address today, which is entitled Beyond the Black Paradigm, Afro-diasporic Strategies in the Age of Neo-Nationalism. Fatima.
Thank you very much, Sarah. It was actually an honor for me to be introduced by one of my longtime partners in crime, and I know it's hard to live up to that, but I'll do my best. Also, many thanks to the organizers, to Angelika, Sara again, Karina, but most of all, to Rosemary, of course. Also, many thanks to the people who decided to sit in the front to make me feel less lonely here. So what I'm trying to talk about today is what the Black German condition, as you might say, can how it can help us to think through questions that are of global importance right now. And I do think what I'm saying connects quite nicely with all of the presentations before. So hopefully we can have a discussion afterwards that connects the whole day. So I guess we can all agree that Afro-diasporic strategies in response to the global rise of neo-nationalism are urgently needed. Violence, poverty, and displacements are escalating. The notion that wealth should translate to power is becoming increasingly explicit again. The commitment to equal rights and equal access is undermined by a mainstreamed rhetoric of entitlement abuse, special rights, and divisive identity politics. The groups that are accused of these rights abuses, who are frequently the same ones suffering most from the above developments, are framed as outsiders destroying a working system and thus in need to be expelled in order for society to return to the desirable, stable, unified state before they arrived or before they gained rights that they can only abuse. These outsiders are created primarily, though not only, through racialization, often reframing groups that are already present as foreign, fundamentally different, and thus without legitimate claims to participation in and ownership of the society they are part of. Anti-Black racism is a key element in this process. It's ever present from daily aggressions such as white people calling the police on Black folks for sitting in a coffee shop or falling asleep in a dorm, or the FBI deciding to invent the category of Black identity extremists rather than surveying white supremacists, or attacks on African refugees across Europe, or the murder of activists like queer Afro-Brazilian Marielle Franco. Within the West, this move to the right receives heightened attention since Trump's election, but it was already evident in the rise of anti-immigrant parties in Europe over the last decade. At the same time, the left's organized response in both Europe and North America is marred by internal conflicts around so-called identity politics. Within the white left, the demand grows to end the supposed focus on special interests identified with feminist, queer, but especially people of color and Black positionalities. These are held responsible for weakening and dividing progressive movements by neglecting the interests of the majority, aka the forgotten white worker. Therefore, so the reasoning goes, it is high time to recenter the global and universal category class and reject divisive distractions such as gender, sexuality, and race. Around the time of Trump's election, this position was expressed, among many others, by feminist theorist Nancy Fraser, US progressive hope Bernie Sanders, and European philosopher Slavoj Žižek. And it is perfectly summarized in a call for papers, the German Zeitschrift für kritische Sozialtheorie, Journal for Critical Social Theory, published for a special issue on anti-racism and anti-imperialism last year. And this is the call for papers was published in German and English. This is an excerpt from the English version. The German one is better in conveying the sense of hurt and indignation that the white authors of this call very clearly feel. So if you're interested, it's still online. You can look at that. But the reason, of course, that I quoted here is that the dichotomy between class analysis and so-called identity politics constructed here implies that an anti-capitalist critique does not only not need to attend to analytical criteria such as race and gender, but indeed must not, since they ultimately lead to racism against white people and anti-Semitism, among other things. There is no escape out of this binary trap, and either-or choice is required. While this could be considered a mere continuation of familiar leftist infighting, it also reflects a need to hold on to the theory of color supposedly criticized here, a theory that is part of a white patriarchal identity politics that indeed needs to be named and deconstructed. The special issue on anti-racism and anti-imperialism has been published by now, and ironically, but not at all surprisingly, every single author happens to be white and male, underlining the startling and systemic blind spot the white left and much of white theory maintains with regard to its own identity politics, which of course can be traced back to the Enlightenment, whose supposed waning influence is bemoaned by the editors of the special issue. It produced the white European man as the paradigmatic human and allowed for a continental Marxist theory still ignoring race as a fundamental analytical category, instead viewing it as a particularist distraction from the universally relevant category class, which is ironic since class is deeply racialized in Europe and elsewhere. This not only prevents the left from implementing actually effective anti-racist strategies, but as recent developments have shown, actively undermines people of color-led anti-racist movements. In order to counter progressive white politics and to understand and resist the current dismantling of democratic values, it is important to acknowledge that these values were always aspirational and inclusion was always contested and conditional. Democracies always coexisted with racism, often explicitly, and not only in the pre-Civil Rights Act US, but also in Europe. The model of post-national democracy, the European Union, was conceived of as including Europe's colonial empire subjugated territory. It were the anti-colonial liberation movements of the 1960s that ended this vision, not some kind of European commitment to equality and democracy for non-Europeans. On the contrary, European democracies were built on the wealth and power secured through centuries of racist exploitation. And this is exactly what the triad of race, class, and gender grounded in Black feminist thinking can address, also and especially in the German context. As you all probably know, contemporary Europeans believe themselves to be genuinely colorblind and often claim not to get race, usually after referencing a supposed American obsession with it. But what Europeans perceive as an American obsession with race is the reflection of a fundamental shift in US society in the wake of the civil rights and subsequent liberation movements, forcing legal, social, political, and discursive changes, certainly not ending racism, but fundamentally challenging its normalization, making it speakable, which is something that did not happen in Europe after the Holocaust and decolonization. And the question was raised before why the US, the African-American paradigm is so dominant within the diaspora, and there are a number of reasons. I think that changes brought about by the civil rights movement are very central here and shouldn't be forgotten. Of course, US imperialism is another reason, especially in the German context with a massive presence of the US military. But a third reason, of course, is European imperialism, more specifically colonialism. When I was growing up, anti-colonial struggles were still going on, and they were geographically much closer to me being in Germany than the US situation, but it was much easier to get information about what was going on in the US because Europe had no interest whatsoever to represent anti-colonial struggles in European territories. What happened instead in Europe after decolonization was the externalization of the history of race and racism. This ongoing racial amnesia was made possible through the erasure of the history of European racism and the history of Europeans of color, making unspeakable processes of internal racialization and the ways in which they are inseparable from the after effects of European colonialism and from neo-colonial economic structures that posit racialized communities increasingly as disposable populations. The lived experience of racialized Germans, of course, sharply contrasts with the widespread belief that race is meaningless in Germany, that they quite literally don't see race. The opposite is true. This is obvious, for example, in Afro migrants being targeted by police, and not only recently, that already happened at least, how long ago are the mid-90s? Long time. Anyway, I was still living in Hamburg then, and there was a sort of scandal that led to eventually to the local government resigning due to a whistleblower who confirmed that there was routine and widespread torture of African migrants going on within the Hamburg police system, but not only there, across Germany. German courts also continue to affirm that racial profiling is legal, not only to determine if someone is a criminal, as with the construction of NAFRI, which sounds kind of cute, but isn't. It means North African Intensive Perpetrator, but also simply in assessing who is German. I lived, before I came to the US, in the Netherlands for quite a while and crossed the border to Germany by train. And it was very obvious that I had to show my passport every time because I was Black, even though the cops continued to say they did it because they were doing their jobs. That this is the same thing, that their job actually is to enforce a racialized notion of Germanness, was something that they obviously didn't question. But you could say that, in fact, my scholarship is rooted in identity politics, originating in this experience, namely the politics of inhabiting an impossible identity, being a Black German. Growing up, it was conveyed to me strongly and constantly that these two things do not go together. As to the why, that was barely an issue. The fact was too obvious to require much of an explanation. If I was Black, I couldn't be German. That correlation remained valid even if my claim to have been born in Germany was accepted by my interrogators, who simply continued to inquire where I was really from. This is an experience shared by millions of people of color across Europe. It's part of a rather rigid script that is triggered by the presence of racialized Europeans who all have to go through many variations of this dialogue. This is no coincidence, of course, but part of a larger system of exclusion. The desire to identify where I was really from, I much later understood, because that was, of course, something that started when I was still a small kid, having been taught to be polite to grown-ups, so I actually answered this question over and over again, which is something I wouldn't do now, but the whole point is that this dialogue is practiced as soon as you can respond, and it's repeated until you give the so-called right response. So, well, I can't complain about that because that's my phone, so. So I apologize to myself and all of you. Okay, so what I later understood was that the desire, or almost the compulsion that white people seem to have in asking me this question was referencing an essence that in the eyes of white Europeans is embodied by all those inhabiting these impossible racialized identities, something in us, visible often, though not always on us, that excludes us from Europeanness forever. And probably the most extreme example of that are Roma and Sinti communities who go through this experience for 500 years with no end in sight. The "why are you here, how can you speak my language, where do you really come from" trope creates a discursive but very real paradox, since the true answer, "I am from here," is precisely the one that is not acceptable, as it falls outside of the logically possible, the thinkable, and the speakable. And, to quote Judith Butler, to move outside of the domain of speakability is to risk one's status as a subject. And this is exactly what is happening here. The questioning is a form of disciplining and silencing, not merely a reaction to a situation that violates the dominant logic, but an active attempt at enforcing it, reconfiguring reality along acceptable lines, while projecting the tension produced by this clash of reality and ideology onto the racialized subject. The only way to gain subject status is to accept a subject position imposed by the unmarked white German who holds discursive and material power. That is, this is an interpolation that produces a social positionality. The racialized subject, to reference Butler again, is still constituted by discourse, but at a distance from itself. Because racialized Europeans lack the discursive power to shape this exchange to such an extent that it could cause a radical break by introducing a legible new option, "I am from here, even though I'm not white," that would in effect destroy the existing paradigm. They are kept invisible and mute between the antagonism of native norm and foreign aberration, only able to seemingly become subjects of speech if they take on the false but acceptable identity, that is the identification as a migrant or foreigner. Terms like second and third generation migrants suggest that racialized populations permanently remain aliens from elsewhere, which is a term that I borrow from Ray Chow. This state of being permanently stuck in a temporary condition is characteristic for the discursive framing of racialized communities in Europe in general. It is a framing that justifies and produces the material conditions of exclusion while preventing the acquisition of rights associated with long-term presence, since it does not place this community within the larger space-time of the nation. In fact, the further away the actual moment or movement of migration is, the stronger the paradox that is the queerness of their presence in space and time. The embodiment of seemingly incompatible spaces and identities is the source of their erasure. Racialized Europeans are situated outside of linear progressive time, relegated instead to a heterotopic space of impossibility, which represents the excess of all utopian visions, be they directed at their absolute exclusion from or complete inclusion into the dominant spatio-temporal framework. So heterotopia here in the sense of something that is already there but cannot be imagined because it seems to be in violation of what we consider possible. So in some ways it's the flip side of the utopia, which is something that is not there, but we still have to be able to imagine it based on what we already experience, if that makes sense. As such, this possibility also becomes a site of potentiality, however. It produces new strategies of resistance, which I summarize as the queering of ethnicity, that is a non-essentialist and non-linear political strategy, not based on racial identity politics, but on the shared experience of being racialized, potentially resulting in a situational, inclusive identity, creating bonds between various marginalized groups, and offering some preliminary tools for theorizing positionality, legibility, and identity beyond Eurocentric universalism and ethnic essentialism. While this practice is grounded less in theory than in the everyday experiences of the nominal second and third generation of migrants who fall between the neat European division of insiders and foreigners, it is in line with queer of color critique's resurrection of queer as a term of materialist intersectional analysis, not merely synonymous with LGBTQI, but referencing processes of constructing normative and non-normative behaviors in populations, recognizing that the interaction of race, class, sexuality, and gender creates more complicated groupings and hierarchies between and within communities than simple dichotomies suggest, and working with rather than against the complex, at times contradictory connections and coalitions this system of heteronormativity produces. This opens the potential of refusing to obey the rules of speakability, expressing exactly the positionality deemed impossible in dominant discourses, namely that of Europeans of color. While multiculturalism constructs and fetishizes difference, women of color feminism and queer of color critique deconstruct neoliberal different but equal discourses that justify and maintain capitalist exploitation by not merely using but producing difference as a means to hide connections between, for example, the privatization of permanent war on the global south and the militarization of civil society in the West, resulting in the mass incarceration of people of color as normalized and profitable forms of population management. The queer of color authors Grace Hong and Roderick Ferguson write, I quote, "The mobilization of difference by women of color feminism and queer of color critique is intended not to erase the differentials of power, value, and social death within and among groups as in a multiculturalist model, but to highlight such differentials and to attempt to do the vexed work of forging a coalition politics through these differences. Queer of color critique allows to highlight the differentials of power produced by a European discourse of belonging that posits racialized others as the group whose exclusion is necessary for the survival of the larger Western project of inclusive humanism, but that also produces and maintains hierarchies among those excluded. And I want to suggest European queer of color activism as a means of both acknowledging the specifics of anti-Blackness and of allowing for a less limited understanding of Blackness, and for people of color coalitions beyond the US model. I believe there's potential in exploring the European constellation because of the different structural position of Blackness there between slavery, colonialism, and migration. I think it's also important to acknowledge that the very term people of color is under much criticism recently, in particular from the group of scholars calling themselves Afro-pessimists, Frank Wilderson, Jared Sexton, Christina Sharp, who see the very notion of people of color primarily as a means to obfuscate anti-Black racism. Afro-pessimism in itself is a reaction to a critique of the focus, or in part a reaction to the critique on the focus on the US and the Middle Passage as constitutive of African diaspora identity, a critique from scholars such as Paul Gilroy, Michelle Wright, or Ronaldo Walcott. Rather than identifying white supremacy as the main structural principle of global domination, for Afro-pessimists, anti-Blackness is central, which obviously shifts the position of non-Black people of color. People of color as a political construct came out of a global anti-colonial movement that emphasized colonialism rather than slavery as a connecting factor, and saw Africa as the center of current and future Black liberation. This moment is definitely gone. Africa is not representing any future, including for Afro-pessimists. Within Afro-diasporic discourse, it is largely relegated to the static embodiment of a lost past. This is problematic not only by centering of the United States and the marginalization of Africa, which fits all too well into existing patterns, it also minimizes the role of colonization in producing anti-Blackness and resistance to it. But Frank Wilderson calls Blackness a structural position, which of course is true as much for Europe as for any other place, a position that is not exactly the same everywhere. Chattel slavery, native dispossession, and genocide were foundational to the United States, but it does not mean that other forms of racism do not exist there, which is very obvious right now with extreme Islamophobia and the criminalization of the undocumented. In addition, in the US context, Blackness is something that immigrant groups of color have to distance themselves from to enter the American mainstream. In fact, one might argue that the very existence of the African American community as a native underclass allows and continues to allow this assimilative upward mobility towards whiteness for immigrants of color. In Europe, on the other hand, immigration often is coded Black. And it is the racialization of religion and colonialism that shaped the continental identity. The two strains of European racism combine in the treatment of the Muslim minority, which faces significantly different conditions in Europe than it does in the US, in part due to its different economic position due to labor and post-colonial migration. The largest part of the racialized poor in West Europe are Muslim, many of them of African descent, and our understanding of Blackness is further complicated in Eastern Europe, where Roma, who are persecuted across the continent, are racialized as Black, not as of African descent, but as Black nonetheless, with related stereotypes. An additional complication is that a significant number of Europeans of African descent are North African, not all of whom are Black, but some are. In Europe, as well as in North America, narratives around racism and Islamophobia separate neatly between Black and Muslim populations, Muslims and Africans, North and Sub-Saharan Africans. The separation is artificial in both contexts, but especially in Europe. A large number of Black Europeans are Muslim, and a large number of Muslims are of African descent. They are the targets of intersecting forms of racism. And an intersectional analysis is necessary not only to address these intersecting racisms, but also to understand how anti-Black racism among non-Black Muslims and Islamophobia among non-Muslim Black populations maintains this system of oppression. In short, Black or African is not a term filled with absolute and essential meaning, but the result of a complicated and continuous process of often asymmetrical interactions and negotiations. While a generalized definition of Black is both methodologically justified and politically necessary, diaspora discourse to a certain extent produces its own subject. The non-normative elements of the Black European experience, rather than justifying their marginalization, could be used to complicate and challenge existing binaries and blind spots, and to decenter the US diaspora experience exactly through applying its theorizations to the European context. North Africa, direct neighbor to both Asia and Europe, and one of the centers of the Muslim world, could be an ideal space to explore these complications, potentially offering some answers to questions around the African diaspora and Islam, or on how racial discourses are transported between the West and the East. But North Africa has largely been excluded from African diaspora studies based on a consensus that follows a framework established by Hegel's division of Africa into three distinct parts, of which the North is supposedly the European one. The model of sub-Saharan Africa is the real Black Africa, and the resulting whitening of the North worked to a large extent for an Africana studies focused on the Americas, but is nothing more than a working model, not a reflection of realities. And what it has to do is to leave out certain things. Earlier the question came up, or it was referenced that many African-American authors who went to Europe throughout the 20th century acknowledged that there's a kind of very much in-your-face racism, but not a lethal threat. That's, of course, not true. In 1961, when many of those African Americans were in Europe, at least 200, maybe up to 400 North Africans were murdered in Paris on a single day, within a few hours, by the French police. So that happened in broad daylight. Being African in Europe at that point was not only, meant not only that you were living under a lethal threat, it literally meant that hundreds of people were killed and then completely forgotten, completely erased from history. The regional, religious, continental, and racial identifications of Africans affect internal as well as external group relations in ways that cannot be approached with a methodology based on the American situation alone, obviously. Thus, the ways in which Africanness and Blackness interact need to be re-examined based on translocal dynamics rather than on preconceived universalist notions. A look at the African diaspora in Europe can be a step in that direction. Its positionality is shaped by the European link between racialization and migration, with its roots in colonialism as much as it is by the larger Black Atlantic constellation produced by racial slavery and the Enlightenment placing of Blacks as anti-human. Continental European developments have been largely absent from theoretical debates within African diaspora studies, primarily due to the continent's supposedly secondary role in the central theme of the diaspora, the transatlantic slave trade. The focus on the latter necessarily defines diasporic populations who have entered the West through different trajectories, such as colonialism, as less representative of the Black Atlantic experience, even though that, of course, tends to downplay the connection between the slave trade and colonialism. A shift to a transnational diasporic perspective, inclusive of marginalized perspectives such as that of Black European or Afro-Latinx populations, requires that the specific cultural, historical, and political conditions that produce the dominant notions of the Black subject within Africana studies are examined and challenged if necessary. So to come back to my initial argument around the potential of queer people of color activism in Europe, the invisibility, if not impossibility, of Black European communities, their lack of spatial and temporal anchoring in national or diasporic formations, facilitated a questioning of heteronormative linear narratives of Black identity. The in-betweenness of Black Europeans created another queer dislocation and simultaneously a space within which to locate resistance. Even though I just have a few boring slides, this turns out to be a very interactive presentation. The queer diasporic positionality encompasses populations that do not necessarily share a common origin, however imaginary it might be, but a contemporary condition. Within this broadened understanding of diaspora, the concept is transformed from a term of temporal and spatial displacement focused on the past towards one of permanent productive dislocation directed at the future. To quote Gayatri Gopinath's path-breaking work on the Indian diaspora, suturing queer to diaspora recuperates those desires, practices, and subjectivities that are rendered impossible and unimaginable within conventional diasporic and nationalist imaginaries. A consideration of queerness, in other words, becomes a way to challenge nationalist ideologies by restoring the impure, inauthentic, non-reproductive potential of the notion of diaspora. And it is no coincidence that queer racialized Europeans, perfectly representing the subaltern of contemporary European discourses around race, religion, gender, sexuality, and migration, are at the center of this potential. Lesbians and trans people of color in particular do not only deal with structural racism, sexism, queer and transphobia in society in general, but simultaneously with these issues within activist communities. They don't ever have the luxury to take it for granted that their voices will be heard and their interests included. The solidarity that they are asked to provide to feminist, queer, Black, Muslim communities is often not granted to them in return, because they remain deviant even in these communities. Nonetheless, lesbians and trans people of color remain key to anti-racist, feminist, and queer movements, often doing the least valued work while being faced with constant ignorance and aggression. At the same time, they also have formed their own spaces of resistance, from the German Black women's collective ADEFRA, which for 30 years has been doing queer and feminist organizing within and beyond the Black German community, or the Dutch Black lesbian group Sister Outsider, the first of its kind in the Netherlands, founded in the mid-80s in response to the work of Black feminists like Audre Lorde, and active simultaneously in feminist, queer, and anti-racist movements to the Black Lives Matter movement in the US, initiated by queer Black women. What these groups have in common is an approach that is attentive to the intersectional lives of people of color. As Audre Lorde put it, there's no such thing as a single-issue struggle because we do not live single-issue lives. Accordingly, they rejected the call to separate struggles around race, class, gender, and sexuality, a strategy often leading to the demand to ignore some issues until others, supposedly more important ones, are solved. They also reject calls to take sides, claims of "you are either with us or against us," loyalty demands directed at those considered politically suspect from all privileged perspectives, especially if they challenge the dominant progressive consensus. While this constellation plays out differently in different contexts, a systemic marginalization of those who face multiple oppressions is a characteristic of progressive politics across Europe and beyond. This radical intersectional activism receives little recognition, and if so, often hostile in forms of claims of reverse racism, of betraying the movement, and so on. These are the people the white socialist authors of the Call for Papers I cited earlier see as dividing the left, but similar conflicts exist in other movements. Queer people of color appears defiant in racist discourse, sexist discourse, revolutionary nationalist discourse, but also in feminist, liberal, LGBT discourse, and often get erased in claims that they are not yet ready to speak, while these same organizations that speak for them appropriate and depoliticize models of resistance originating in this radical activism. All this leads to the realization that we must start our political work from the recognition that multiple systems of oppressions are in operation not side by side, but intersecting and depending on each other. Therefore, it is impossible to dismantle capitalism without dismantling racism, which cannot be dismantled without dismantling sexism, and so on. This does not mean that particular struggles cannot be prioritized, but it means that inclusion in the existing system is not enough. The system itself needs to be changed. To quote Black lesbian feminist Kathy Cohen with regard to same-sex marriage rights, civil rights do not change the social order in dramatic ways. They change only the privileges of the group asserting those rights. Homophobia does not originate in our lack of full civil equality. Rather, homophobia arises from the nature and construction of the political, legal, economic, sexual, racial, and family systems within which we live, end quote. Therefore, all of these intersecting systems need to be changed before liberation can be achieved. If we understand liberation as the absence of a system of scarcity in which the withholding of basic human rights is not an exception, but the very logic around which the system is built. This also means that in order to form successful coalitions, we need to be honest about the ways in which these intersecting power structures affect us differently and create relative privilege for some of us because of our gender, race, religion, nationality, social class, and so on, privileges for which we have to take responsibility if we want to create lasting coalitions. This is a daunting task. The realization that all oppression is connected can be threatening. Questioning the dominant narrative does not only change our image of the other, but also the image of ourselves. It reminds us that being part of the same community, sharing the same identity, does not automatically mean we fight the same fight. But it also shows that common interest exists across national, religious, gender, ethnic lines. All oppression is connected, but so is resistance across the globe. And new kinds of coalitions, connections, and unity can emerge at any point, and they do. Even if these coalitions, for example, between socialist, feminist, queer, revolutionary Muslim activists in the squares of Cairo and Istanbul, between Black, German, and Namibian anti-colonial activists around the issue of reparations and repatriation, or between West African and West Asian refugees in Germany, are ephemeral and often end up seemingly domesticated into traditional single-issue formations, they show constellations emerging that are often deemed impossible. It is this politics of possibility, however momentary, that makes intersectional coalitions so powerful. But in order to build them, we have to be attentive both to histories of struggles and to current constellations. This means that we cannot follow a path that others have created, even if it worked for them. If we want to create truly transformative change, we cannot look for leaders. Instead, we have to learn to trust ourselves. As poet, activist, and academic June Jordan observed almost 4 decades ago, I quote, "We are not powerless. We are indispensable despite all atrocities of the state and corporate policy to the contrary. At the very least, if we cannot control things, we certainly can mess them up," end quote. Thank you.
one back there.
Hi. Oh, should I just go?
Oh, I'll get
go
after. I'll get.
Okay. So, thank you so much for your talk. A lot of really insightful comments about the current situation in Europe and a lot of references that I need to look up. I wanted to ask you a question about your thoughts on Afro-pessimism. I found that really interesting. It's text that I've been dealing a lot with in my work. So I thought your critique was very spot on about whether or not Afro-pessimism centers the Black American experience too much and to what extent it could hinder coalition building. And I wanted to say that, so personally, one of the things that I found really useful about Afro-pessimism in the focus of anti-Blackness was this notion that anti-Blackness exists all over the world. And it made me think of this experience I had once in Berlin, in Kreuzberg, where one of the times I got called the N-word in Berlin was in Kreuzberg, by a Turkish German. And so this notion that in all communities, even communities that might think of themselves as people of color, there can be anti-Blackness. And so I was wondering, so there's been interesting work done on the problem of anti-Blackness in Muslim communities, maybe more so by American scholars. So I was wondering, in your work with Black Muslims in Europe, has that ever been an issue that people have raised? Like, have they expressed dealing with anti-Blackness in Muslim communities in Europe?
Yeah, sure. I mean, people have expressed it, but it is a very touchy issue. During the earlier presentation about current activism in Germany, I was reminded of what I think was one of my formative experiences, which was a weekend meeting, I think in the early 90s, somewhere in northern Germany in the countryside. And it was West African, it was a feminist meeting, West African women, Black German women, Turkish German women, mostly Kurdish women. And it was a disaster. I mean, it was a huge fight. Everything exploded. Because, yeah, as I said, and as we all know, even if you want to be on the same side, we aren't necessarily, because there's lots of pressures on us to place ourselves in a particular existing hierarchy. And even if we question one element of it, it doesn't necessarily mean that we question the other or know how to do that. So I do think, because you said it's not really talked about right now, I wonder if it needs to be talked about in a way we talked about then, which was more like yelling at each other, because there was so much going on many levels. There was the question of something that activists are used to talk about much more now, unacknowledged privileges. So African migrant women wanted us as Black Germans to think about what it means to have a German passport. And then what a strong impulse was not to necessarily think about that, but instead to turn to the Turkish women and ask them to think about white skin privilege. So considering the fact that, at least I believe, we live in a global system of racial capitalism, it is impossible, I think, to create a safe space in which we just talk about that, because the conditions are so difficult that this is a conversation that can be constructive in the long run, but I don't think at the moment when it happens. And structurally, there's a huge difference between a German Muslim of Turkish descent, for example, and a Syrian Muslim from Syria who's been in Germany for 4 weeks. So what you have is people using intersections and connections to try to start conversations. but I don't know if you ask, is there an acknowledgement of anti-black racism, or also on the other end on Islamophobia among especially Christian black people? I know that is an issue that is more present, but also very touchy in France. And it's often tabled along the lines of, if you want to have a collision about police violence right now, let's not talk about that. So yeah, but I think that's just a part of coalitional politics. And I do think that Afro-pessimism opens up certain topics and then immediately closes them again in a frustrating way. But of course, I think Afro-pessimists ask a lot of important questions. And I do think the notion of people of color is one that needs to be interrogated and not taken for granted.
Thank you for being present. I know that we live in a global milieu that is dominated by the European, I would say the European perspective of how things operate, or I should say European system, that is predominantly says that we have a structure that we know best. We know how things work. You need to follow us because we have all the answers, so to speak. My question is that we have a global fruit basket of wisdom from people not only from the European North, but also from the Asian East and the African South and the First Nations West. And so there's a basket of wisdom there that if we think that, or if we want to become or be healthy, optimally, we need to draw on these wisdom. And so what I'm trying to say is that how can we move forward? What is the plan to move forward to draw on all these different diverse wisdom to enable us to see folks and see the differences as something useful to be utilized collectively?
What is the plan, huh? Well, I think in some ways we all are being fairly resilient just because we're here and not lying in bed with a cover over our heads, which I think would be an almost healthy reaction to what's going on right now. But I do think that what is part of this European model that claims to know everything is also this idea of very linear time and linear movements and linear notions of cause and effect. I think that while things might look very bad right now, other models are already in motion. We might not see exactly where they will be going, and that requires a certain faith that sometimes it's hard to keep, but I think in the end it's the more optimistic position, because if we use this traditional model that is also very often characteristic of the left, we can only lose, but we lose because the powers that are against us are so overwhelming. So that we get up and fight again is in some ways a victory, and it's more materially a victory because fights, it's also how we tell stories, right? Because in some ways, the whole Occupy Wall Street movement was not necessarily my thing, but it wouldn't be wouldn't have been possible without the so-called Arab Spring, which also took place in West Africa. But coming back to this recurring thing of the domination of U.S. models or U.S. discourses or U.S. culture, once it lands in the U.S., it becomes legible across the world, so that when something similar happens in Istanbul, which is much closer connected to the indignados in Spain, or the people in Cairo or Tunisia, they instead call themselves Occupy, because this is a kind of language that indicates a connection. So part of the problem, I think, is that we don't have a language that easily describes other connections. For example, South-South connections, but also others. But those connections are there. And I do think this basket of wisdom that you refer to is drawn upon in ways that I think don't produce a master plan. I think the master plan is also one of those models that we have to get rid of. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. That's something I think a lot about, where I see things happening that I know are made possible because of other things that have happened, but very often there's no knowledge, which disempowers us, right? Because we do something and we think it's the first time, which makes it much harder. People have done it before, but that knowledge has been repressed, so we have to find ways to collect that knowledge. I think that's one thing, to make it accessible. And then we have to use it. And I do think it happens all the time, locally, translocally. So I can't really tell you what the plan is, but I do think that that resistance is happening. Okay, I'm glad.
Test. Now is it on? Yeah. I appreciated your talk. Thank you very, very much. One thing that African American educators talk about is the need to, when you're trying to bring about change, to address the structural, but also the individual, and things like implicit bias. And I'm wondering if that's kind of a prerequisite for queerness, is to sort of look inward also and kind of look at biases. And I'm wondering if in the activist work that you do, if that's part of the process, as kind of not just addressing the structural, but these sort of biases that everybody has towards other groups, even when you're working within a group.
I think it's a necessity if you speak from a subject position that is not the dominant one in a particular context, because you're forced to explain yourself, and you're forced to explain yourself in a way that is relatable. And in terms of activism, I think you have to make choices. I feel connected to various communities because of my own positionality, I would say, not necessarily identity. I do think that structural is central, but the structural, of course, is played out in individual interactions as well. That's why that's part of the reason I talked about this endless, where are you from? Because it's very often seen as an individual thing, right? It's not, it's structural. It's individuals playing out as structures, whether they know it or not. So yeah, I do think it's probably, or maybe being Black, queer, culturally Muslim, I was forced to think more about my positionality maybe than others. Maybe not. But I'm not sure I get what your question is, but the structure and the individual always interact. But certainly, this is also a frustration very often with white people, right, who want the separation, who, want to be recognized as good people because they recognize the structure, which is a pretty tiresome process. But yeah, I don't know. Yeah, it's connected. I don't know if that's what you asked.
Yes, I appreciated your talk very much. I just wanted to ask you a question about being lost in translation. You had this argument that basically it's a question about how negotiate the global when there's a question whether there is such a thing. And I would like to put it that way. So, which I know is for Afro-German communities an issue, but it is also an issue for other communities. This question is that when the discourse migrates to the States and then comes back, let's say to Europe, to Asia, to Africa, wherever, your argument was that it becomes sort of a more universal discourse or lingua. But I wanted to ask you also how do you negotiate what is actually precisely lost in that translation when it comes back? Because I think that's where actually one of the frontiers is to actually negotiate the more insidious repressive moments of globalization, which is where capitalism may actually be just even like a lesser issue, but there's like a more repressive issue of like how this it's not a linguistic issue, but it's one of like how this translation works. So that would be my question: how you would negotiate that, let's say, between the German situation and maybe also the American situation, because you're operating in both discourses, and so I'd like to hear your thoughts about that.
Maybe you should read my thoughts on that, because that's a huge topic that I've worked on a lot, and I don't think I can summarize in 2 minutes or so. I do agree with you that translation is a huge issue, and that there's a tension between the need to find a common language and the inability to really translate all specifics. At the same time, of course, we have to acknowledge that a lot of stuff gets translated anyway. One thing that I find striking about Germany is that you have so much talk about political correctness and identity politics, and how there's an attack on white males, blah, blah, blah. So very much the discourse that you have in the US, but in the US, you can at least read it as a reaction to pressure being put at this complete discursive dominance that white males had at a certain point. In Germany, this dominance still exists. So why do these people feel that the US discourse can be translated? Why do white journalists in liberal newspapers write about this again and again? Because it speaks to something that they find translatable. So what I'm trying to say is that while we have to be very critical and conscious of the process of translation, and can't just assume that we speak the same language, we also have to think about when translation becomes an issue and when it is just accepted as part of a transnational discourse. And I do think the fact that a very common European reaction to raising the issue of race is to say, well, this is an Americanization of European culture, is something that should give us pause. Because it is a way to end certain discussions when they come from a subject position that is not the dominant one, the white one. So yeah, as I said, translation and what gets lost in translation is an endless topic, a very important topic. Yeah, I also think that one thing that we can do, rather than just throw up our hands and say, yes, everything, something gets lost in translation all the time, which is true, is to try to be very careful in tracing the process and to acknowledge a certain genealogy and where terms come from. one thing that I find a little frustrating in the European discussion among queer people of color, sometimes, to come back to the notion of queerness, is that especially in France, people are like, leave me alone with queer. That's a totally white term. But of course, the reason for that, and it's true because it has been appropriated by a very white movement in France, but what this white movement also did, and what many of the white American authors that those white French people translated did, was to ignore the fact that queer authors of color, like Audre Lorde, like Gloria Anzaldúa, were at the beginning of this process. So in some ways, if you reject a particular term without knowing its full history, you might also cut yourself off from a counter narrative. So yeah, it's complicated, I guess. It's what I can say in short.
Hi, thank you, Fatima. I'm going to stick with this question of process. Holding this position of respecting intersectionality, realizing they all have to go on at the same time, that not choosing sides, of not going just full on one issue and saying this is the issue. How does one hold that position when everyone, including those going after the other issues, even in solidarity, are pushing you in a different direction? I guess how do you stay in that, I don't know whether you want to call it a queer space that says, no, I'm not going to disrespect these other positions. I'm going to actually hold this one. I agree completely. We can't know the goal because the goal has to emerge from our human interaction. So I'm more concerned with the process and how one stays loyal to those things you were holding up. Make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. I don't think I have an easy answer, but this is, I think, part of the potential of queer of color critique. And one of its foundational authors, Jose Munoz, for me in a very insightful way, talks about how queer of color critique cannot offer you a position. It doesn't give you rules, and if you apply them and if you act this particular way, then you will stay on course. What it requires is for you to constantly question your own position. And of course, that's exhausting, and sometimes you just don't want to do it, but you have to do it. And I do think queer people of color do it not because they're more advanced than other people, but for them it's more a question of survival, because if you ignore certain things, you ignore certain parts of yourself, and what that does, you feel immediately before other people might feel it. Yeah, I mean, generally it is, I think, being able to simultaneously have faith and accept a certain uncertainty as your permanent state. It is very challenging, but I also think that's the reason why situational coalitions are a good model, because at certain points it might be possible to work with others and achieve something, but then you have to break off the coalition. And then the usual model would be say, well, everything you did together is now discredited. But the challenge is to not do that, to just accept this is how far it goes, and we might intersect at some point, but at this point it doesn't work. Yeah, and it is, it's not something that is easy to sell because it's hard work and you don't gain something really tangible. But on the other hand, all these other seemingly much more simple methods obviously don't work. So.
Hello. Oh. This talk has been such a gift, Fatima. Thank you so much. I wanted to ask you a question about creolization, because I know that it's a concept that you work through in European others. And if you could talk a bit about what's productive and prohibitive with this concept and thinking about some of these same issues in terms of Black European and Black German studies, and especially what you were saying about the diversity within communities?
Well, I think in terms of creolization, people use the concept meaning different things, and I think it's kind of in line with what I just said about queer of color critique. It can be useful, but you can't just say I'm doing creolization and then you have the right take on things. What I found very useful, especially with Glissant's work, was a way to think about, in some ways, about a presence that is not grounded, or about the question of authenticity, right? Because this is something that comes up with Blackness, but also in other contexts, what is the authentic Black subject? And how can you let go of that without letting go of a common notion of Blackness? And to me, creolization was a model that could offer that, because it's, or at least in the way I understood it. Or another way of putting it was what Toni Morrison said about Black culture. One of the characteristics of Black culture being just to basically pick up what you find and do something with it, which in some ways for me is creolization. It's not just to pick and choose, because you can. It's circumstances put you in a particular position, and these are the options you have. And what you do is not try to create, or at least in Glissant's sense, to try to create what he calls a sacred model. So out of these pieces that you find, you create a seamless whole. What you do instead is you use the pieces. Yeah, I think that's the best I can say right now, at least.
Thank you, Fatima. The last point that you made me go back to the gentleman here who talked about the different fruits of wisdom, and the idea that we often, we talk to students about going into communities or to doing internships or to do service learning, and the idea is not to go in thinking that you know all the answers and that the community has none and is just waiting for you to show up, as opposed to knowing that there are things going on and where you can fit in and take those pieces and do something with them. In your discussion about coalition buildings, one of the things that I think sometimes gets left or gets short shrift is the whole notion that before we get to the coalition, we have to have allies. And when you were talking about different groups coming together and how it deteriorated, I have a Southeastern Asian colleague and friend with whom in New Orleans next week, we're working with student leaders about excellence in writing and so forth, and we were talking about how to get to that point. What would we be doing? What kind of writing would we be asking them to produce toward the end of the workshop? And she does work with deliberative dialogue and the different approaches to how you actually do listen to others when they're presenting on particular issues. And so one of the things we talked about is how things can go south, as we say, because we lose the point of the dialogue and turn to debate. And then in debate, it's who's going to be heard the loudest, or whose pain is the most, and so forth. And the whole idea of moving forward seems to get lost. So I was wondering if you would possibly speak a little bit to the building toward the coalition that has been happening in the work that you do and what you see in terms of Afro-Germans and in Germany and so forth.
Well, I have to tell you, one of the, I don't miss many things about Germany, but I do miss some things. And one of the things I miss is how much Germans like to argue about everything. So to your point about debate, I don't know. I think sometimes things have to go south or break apart. I don't think it's, yeah, I don't know. I feel like that it's important to listen, it's important to keep coalitions, but very often it's also important to be honest about differences, and that is a process that's a lot more painful. And I don't think I'm not sure if our ambition should always be to deal with those differences in a constructive way, and if we don't know how to do it, just not to do it. Maybe it's okay to just yell at each other and to learn that that's not the end of the world. Because I don't know. If I think about activism and the people I would trust most, it's not the people I never fought with. So I think in some ways it's a cultural difference, because Germans like to argue, but that has obvious disadvantages. After I left Germany, I first moved to the Netherlands, and it was awesome because the Dutch people are so polite. They just don't tell you what they think, which is great because what they think is exactly what the Germans think, so you don't really need to hear it. But you know, you need a balance, and I feel like especially for people of color and especially in activism, so much is at stake. So the idea that you might have a fallout can be so threatening that it's you know, it's a sensible decision to just not go there. At the same time, sometimes we do have to go there, but I mean, the system puts us in a position where we constantly have to make painful choices. So with coalitions and allies, yeah, I do. I mean, I personally, I work on coalitions within communities of color because I feel that there's enough common ground that potentially these fallouts don't have to be the end. With white people, I mean, yeah. How do you do the whole listening thing? If you're historical, white people have to shut up for the next 500 years. They're not going to do that. So, so to be all fair, yeah, that would be great. But maybe you just can't be. I don't know. I mean, I don't have a right answer, but obviously that's something we all who are in activist communities think about a lot of times. But that's also what brings me back to women of color feminism, black feminism, the question of difference, right? And how difference can be powerful if we're not scared of it. But of course, we're taught constantly to be scared of difference. So we have to unlearn that. And part of it is definitely to listen, to learn to listen. But part of it is also to allow ourselves to say things that we have been trained not to say.
When one of the other or both in concert with each other do then reach a point where other people are listening. It's a communication issue, and it wasn't about either or. It's about knowing when which actually is being most effective, but certainly having them both in your toolkit to use when they're necessary. Thank you for your answer.
Performance. I Walk on Air, which will be, it's roughly 4 blocks south here on St. George, so you just continue on this street, just use that as a reference point regardless of where you're headed next for dinner. That's free admission, as you know, but please share the word anyway if you know of other friends that might be interested in coming. It's not too late to recruit them. And if you need any suggestions for places to eat, please don't hesitate to turn to Karina or myself or Jillian or Veronica. We've gotten to know a few faces today for suggestions specific to your interests. So I guess, guten appetit, bon appetit. And the building is the Robert Gill Theater. However, that is not, it's good that you ask actually, it's not clearly labeled because it's a building that houses a number of different, well, it has a number of different functions, but Jillian and Veronica will be in front just to sort of reassure you, yes, this really is the right place, so go by house number, and the entrance is an entrance, yes, but it doesn't look like a grand theatrical entrance, so be forewarned. It's in the same building as the bookstore, but you won't see the bookstore when you go to the theater. So when you go in the building, immediately there's a staircase, a grand staircase, and just follow it to the 3rd floor.